So we're looking up at this beautiful bird figure up here, and it is obviously a turkey. And the other day, there was a flock of turkeys walking around here, and I was able to pick up a few fluffs and a couple of the wing feathers. So the Comanche people, we didn't eat birds because they were considered to be unclean. So they were allowed to walk the terrain without too much danger. But you get the other cultures coming in, and the turkey becomes a food source. But for the Pueblo people, it is a herd animal. They have herds of 2,000 birds. And that bird, again, is not eaten. You don't find too much evidence in hearths or anything. Hearth is a fire pit. So when you're camping and you're telling stories, they put a circle of rocks and you roast your little marshmallows to make s'mores in it. Back then, they would sit around and be cleaning birds, but each feather has a reason for its being. So on a turkey, there's dark feathers and there's lighter feathers. And this bird comes up from the south, from Peru. And when he was living in Peru, he's golden. So anything that has gold in color becomes like a god. So he's praised as this kind of animal. Then when he's moved up north, his food changes, his environment changes, and he starts to take on the colors in defense mode. He becomes brown and green, and his gold still remains just on the edge of his tail feathers. You still see that iridescent goldish color within that turkey, even though he becomes domesticated. So when you're talking about using feathers for blankets, there are several techniques that different tribes used. And one of the turkey feather blankets that I create is a Pueblo style blanket. But in looking in collections, they're using several birds and using pristine colors: bluebirds, blue jays, robins, just the red chest of the robin, to add into color into these blankets. So this turkey becomes one of the warmest becomes one of the warmest blankets you can possibly have during a time where the environment's changing. We talk about global warming now. Back then, there were these freezing time period zones. So rabbit fur predates turkey feather blankets, but these become the Cadillac of blankets. They become the Tesla car of a blanket. And remember that blanket, if you look at European interpretation of blanket, you get king, queen, you know, sizes. For the people, it was more like a shawl or a wrap. And this blanket, when you're born, they give you that first turkey feather blanket that's probably only 2 foot by 3 foot, and your baby wrapped in it. As you grow, they leave what we call as weavers an open end. So it can be opened up, the knot comes off, you spin more cordage, and you add to the warp, and then you also add to the length of it. So now this blanket not only keeps you warm as a baby, it becomes your burial shroud when you go to the other side. Now we use Pendleton blankets to wrap our people in, and they're sewn in and then put into the ground. A long time ago, the Comanches would put them under the rock, and they'd be sewn in a blanket the same way and put into a crevice burial. The Pueblo don't use caskets either, and they just bury them so that they dissolve a lot faster, decompose, and that way they can bury on top of one another. This ritual burying of a person in a crevice, whatever animals and creatures eat it, it's a good thing because your being goes into these animals and they go back out into the world, and you're still actually a part of that energy of life. So the turkey, of course, he's kind of a silly bird, but he can become quite domesticated. We ate some of the eggs because you're finding eggshell in some of the hearths or the fire pits in shells, but you never again find the bones. If a turkey's died, he's actually given, in some instances in burials, he's given a ritual burial, and men who have high rankings were buried with their personal turkey on the side. So that bird must have been his favorite. You know, how you always had your dog or your horse sometimes. It would be the same for these turkeys. The fletching, the wing feathers, the body feathers are used for blankets. The wing and tail were used for weapons. And if you look at the the people that were here, you see some arrowheads, some weaponry, but there's a good source of chert material, which is a rock that's a river sedimentation that's pressurized and becomes a chert, and they would flake that and make these beautiful arrowhead points, and then tie it to a arrow shaft, and the Comanche shaft had a lifeline down it that was painted green. That meant that was our arrow, and it had red on the tip, which meant that they were ready to die or ready to kill. And at the end, the fletch is always a turkey feather. And then later on, it changes. Depends on what kind of medicine you're making or what kind of war you're making. It could be a hawk on the end. Maybe you found the dead um, um, bird on the prairie or out here, and you used his wing feathers, but it's always a wing feather. And the reason being is that wing feathers or fletch feathers are waterproof. Body feathers are not. They will absorb water. So if you pay attention to birds, you see them after a rain, they'll puff up and they're drying their body feathers, and their wing feathers, the water just beads off. So um, keep in mind the anatomy about that bird when you're looking at little birds. You know, which ones like water, which ones are just in flight. So knowing that this turkey was very, very important to a lot more people than the Pueblo, and that's a good thing. So